And here we go with a very special Easter Sunday broadcast for everyone. I have two men in the studio right now that I am very excited to bring on. We have Kenneth, who is going to be the atheist, and then we have Dean, who is the Christian. And what they are going to be talking about is if Jesus really rose from the dead. Now, as most know, I personally am an atheist, but I will be off screen throughout this entire thing, monitoring. I will not be interjecting and asking questions. I want this conversation to stay between the two of them. If you have any questions, put them in the comments and we will address them towards the end of the broadcast. If I do come up with any questions, as long as they're fair and balanced to both sides, I will ask them. Otherwise, I will stay completely neutral. So first, I'd like to introduce Kenneth. Kenneth, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm taking the negative position today. I'm an atheist. Spent the majority of my life as a Christian. And while I was in college, sort of started to examine my beliefs and found that I didn't have what I felt to be sufficient reasons to hold on to them. My background academically was I studied English literature as an undergrad, and I went to law school at Fordham University in New York, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks again, Kenneth. Dean, a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I've been a Christian my whole life. That doesn't mean I haven't had serious times of question and doubt. Out of high school, I served in the Marine Corps for 6 years in the reserves. Came back, went to the Bear Valley Bible Institute International in Denver, Colorado, and then I finished up my undergrad at Amherst University. I just graduated from Biola University. The executive director of the Daily Apologist, 501c3. I like Duke basketball, coffee, and of course, Star Wars. There you go.
Well, you know what? There we can agree. I love Star Wars. Kenneth, are you a Star Wars fan?
Huge Star Wars fan. Huge.
Awesome. So we got our first agreement. 3 Star Wars fans, all in the same room.
Let's stop the debate.
Yeah. It's a shame they only made those 3 Star Wars movies back in the 70s and 80s.
It's unfortunate. It is unfortunate.
So this will not be a formal debate. This is a conversation where both sides are going to present their opinion and then offer counter opinions or disagreements. So, for example, if you tuned into my last broadcast with Joel Sedicase, we spent 45 minutes trying to agree on the definition of knowledge. That's not what will be happening here. This will be a friendly conversation. And the important takeaway is you decide. Everyone at home decide who provided the best information. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? So without further ado, I'd like to get this started. So Ken, you believe Jesus rose from the dead. Is that correct?
I do. I am not convinced.
You're not. I'm sorry. I didn't mean Ken. I meant Dean. I apologize. Dean.
That's okay.
Hey, that ain't the worst thing I've ever been called. I was in the Marine Corps for 6 years. So I do believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And so really out of all the things that we talk about as Christians, all the things that we debate about, all the things that we talk about.
So yes, you are taking that position. So without further ado, I'm going to let this conversation start. I am going to step away. I'll be monitoring you. Dean, the floor is yours.
Gotcha. So obviously today is Easter Sunday. And when we talk about the resurrection, it is the central pillar of Christianity. 15, essentially, that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then your faith is in vain. It's useless. Your faith is futile. And so in the conversation tonight, once again, I want to thank Ethan for hosting, Ken for, is it okay if I call you Ken, or would you prefer
Absolutely.
Ken?
Absolutely.
Okay. No. Thanks for coming on and having this discussion. So to kind of keep our discussion limited, because there's so much that goes with the resurrection, I'm really going to just defend 4 basic positions. The first being that Jesus died by crucifixion. After that, he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Shortly after that, the disciples of Jesus believed that they had seen the risen Jesus bodily, and then Paul's conversion. Now, for the audience sake, there are a couple things that I'm not going to do tonight. I'm not going to appeal to ancient prophecy from the Old Testament, and I'm not going to appeal to inerrancy. I'm not going to appeal to divine inspiration. I'm strictly going to go off of historical methodology. That way, the conversation can be more level and we don't have to get grounded into, okay, well, was Isaiah 53 an actual prophecy? What was the makeup of all that? So that's essentially where I'm going to be tonight. So, we can take it from there wherever you want to go.
Okay. Well, so out of the gate, I want to commend Dean for being here and for doing this, and also thank Ethan for hosting. I've done discussions of this type for a number of years, and defending the historicity of the resurrection is not something that I've engaged in that conversation with someone before. But as Dean mentioned, I mean, that is the central claim of Christianity. So what I want to focus on is the idea that it is a claim, and focus on the distinction between a claim and evidence for the claim. I don't think that there's any issues here with Dean and I sort of disputing who does and doesn't have a burden of proof here. So I would assert that the time to believe a claim is when there is sufficient evidence for that claim. I think Dean would probably agree with me on that point. So I think that where we're going to get into the weeds a little bit tonight is on whether or not the evidence stands up to scrutiny. So I think that, we might as well dive in.
Yeah. And, before I start diving in, one of the things that I'd like to establish is that we are talking about history, and certainly history. I think you and I would both agree that history isn't a hard science, right? It's not like astrophysics or cosmology or any of the hard sciences. It's a soft science. And so just for the audience, and just so that we have a working definition of what history is, would you agree that history is the study of past events that are brought to us, particularly in human affairs? They come in fragmented and somewhat, they come in fragmented. They don't come in essence to establish something that's historical. You couldn't say that, pieces of history are 100% certain, I guess is what I'm saying. So historians would say, we're arguing for the inference to the best explanation of what most probably happened. Right.
I was going to say exactly. I was going to use the word probabilistic.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that what you just laid down is extremely useful. And I think that there's a distinction to be made between history and myth. And I think that we've only spoken once previously, but I don't take the Jesus mythicist position. By which I mean, for those who might not be familiar with that, there are there's a sort of growing body of literature of individuals who assert that Jesus is a figure like Harry Potter or King Arthur. And actually, King Arthur is a bad example because there's an idea that King Arthur may have been inspired by an actual living person. And that is, just in interest of full disclosure, the position that I find myself in with respect to Jesus. I think that I don't think that arguing about whether or not there was a real historical figure is useful. I think, though, that addressing specific biblical claims about that figure, was he born of a virgin? Did he walk on water? Was he raised from the dead? That's where the conversation should be happening.
No, I agree. And so I'm not here tonight to say that, or to defend historically that Jesus was born of a virgin. I'm just being clear. We're talking about the resurrection. So I'll just go ahead and dive into, the first piece, which would be that Jesus died by crucifixion. And so when I look at the evidence, I see that Jesus' death is attested by a multitude of ancient sources, both Christian and non-Christian. So we have Jesus' death by crucifixion at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Also non-canonical gospels like the Gospel of Peter. And then we also have it in ancient sources. Now, these other ancient sources like Tacitus, Marbar, Serapion, and so on, they attest probably to the death, not probably, I think they attest to the death of Jesus at the hands of Pontius Pilate. And so even modern scholars like J.D. Crossan, who's a member of the Jesus Seminar, who believes that the majority of things that are said in the New Testament and the red letters weren't by Jesus. He states this, if I can just read this quote, he goes, Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. For if no follower of Jesus had written anything for 100 years after his crucifixion, we would still know about him from two authors among his supporters. So that's a guy that's not favorable to what I would call common evangelical Christianity, so to speak. Paula Fredrickson, who's a skeptical scholar with regards to this, says that, hey, this is a part of the Jesus narrative. This is part of his life. Gerd Ludemann, in Resurrection of Jesus, he says death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. You've got Geza Vermesh, who's a Jew, says the passion of Jesus is part of history. So I think at least on point one, and I've got more, but for the sake of the conversation, I want to give you a fair amount of time to respond. I think on point one, that Jesus died by crucifixion at the hands of Pontius Pilate, I think that is pretty firm, historically speaking. What are your thoughts on that, Ken?
So I think that you're probably more familiar with the historical record there than I am. My understanding of Josephus, of Pliny, of the oldest non-Christian sources that we have, is that those reference Christians more than they reference Christ. Mm-hmm. That there's more of a reference to people who believe that Jesus was crucified by Pilate. Now, I could be mistaken on this point. I think that again, if we're playing the probabilistic game here, that it seems to me reasonable that a figure named Jesus very likely may have been crucified at the hands of Pontius Pilate. So I think that's a place where we could probably plant a flag. And
so you said he was probably more likely what?
I think that if we're addressing this from a probabilistic standpoint, that making the claim that an individual named Jesus was crucified by a local Roman magistrate, I don't have any problem with that. That seems like a perfectly reasonable and plausible thing to have happened from where I'm sitting.
Okay, cool. So it seems like we agree on at least one point of
sure.
Tonight. So my second point is that, shortly after his death, that he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And the reason why I make that claim is twofold. Number one, I think we have really good early independent attestation to it. And once again, for the sake of the conversation, I'll count Matthew, Mark, and Luke as one source. I'll go ahead and cede the idea that they were the synoptic gospels that Matthew and Luke copied from Mark. Excuse me. Just for the sake of the conversation, I don't want to go down the road of, are they independent, Q, and the synoptic problem, all that stuff. So I'll go ahead and see that those are that's one source. The other source is John. They're independent from one another. Both sources, the synoptics and John, say that Joseph of Arimathea, received the body of Jesus, that they were buried in a family tomb by his, and those are the earliest sources that we have for the life of Jesus. And so I would say that that's good attestation. I think the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is a general outline of what takes place with regards to that. And we can look at that a little bit later. I think another piece of evidence there for the burial of Jesus would be Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6 connects Christian baptism to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And so what you have there in Romans 6, which is very interesting, is that he says that just as Christ was, died, was buried, and was raised, the Christian dies, is buried, and is raised to walk in newness of life in baptism. So it seems to me that it would be ill-informed, or not ill-informed, it would be theological trouble for Paul to make such a deep connection between Christian baptism and the burial of Jesus if that burial didn't happen. So I think that that's a piece that we need to look at as well. So I'll kick it back to you. What do you think about that? A fair assessment, unfair assessment? Go ahead and start poking holes.
I was going to ask you really quick. Would you mind just reading the passage from Romans 6 one more time?
Right. So 1 second. Let me get it out if that's okay.
Yeah.
I don't have it in front of me. So he says here, Romans 6, it says, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who have died to sin still live in it? Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ were baptized into his death? We were buried, therefore, with him by baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. Okay.
And this ties in beautifully to 1 Corinthians 15, if I'm remembering my scripture. So sort of addressing these things in order. So my first thoughts are that I'm unclear how anything in Paul's writings connects to Joseph of Arimathea. To my memory, there's nothing in 1 Corinthians 15, which, if my memory serves me, predates the Gospels, right, by a couple decades. So there's nothing mentioning Joseph of Arimathea in those initial sort of foundational creeds. I recognize that the point of Jesus being buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea isn't necessarily central to the theology of soteriology, which is a big word for the study of salvation. I shouldn't be throwing stuff out there like that. I'm sorry.
There you go.
So so that's I guess I'm a little bit. Point one would be I'm a bit confused about why one would reference Paul if what we're trying to establish is Jesus was buried in a tomb provided by Joseph of Arimathea. And right. Then the problem that I have with sort of using the synoptic gospels as foundational sources is that the resurrection narratives don't precisely line up in detail. There's questions like, who went to the tomb first? Was it just Mary? Was it two Marys? Was it the women, as it is in John? Was the stone rolled away? Was it not? Was there someone sitting in the tomb? Did two men appear in the tomb? There's all of these discrepancies that I think undermine the credibility of the narrative there to some extent. So, and then in addition to those sort of initial discrepancies, I'm sure that you've heard it wouldn't have been common practice at the time for crucified individuals to have been released from Roman custody and then handed over to even a high profile, I believe Joseph of Arimathea would have been a member of the Sanhedrin, if I remember correctly. They would have been kept on the cross for a while as a message from the Romans, don't mess with the Romans. And then they were typically tossed in mass graves. So this is a thing when apologists bring up these sort of, foundational, minimal facts of the resurrection narrative. I always wonder why the Joseph of Arimathea thing even matters.
Gotcha. So from what I have right here on my notepad, I've got 3 things that you've mentioned. Is it okay if I go down those?
Please, yeah.
One? Okay. So the only thing that I'm trying to establish in the connection with Paul to Joseph of Arimathea is twofold. One, the earliest source material we have note that Jesus was buried, right? That's a part of the core theology early on, between 3, at least in 1 Corinthians 15, between 3 and 7 years after Jesus' death. Paul's writing in Romans is later than that. But that also, just because, and this I guess would also be another point, that just because Paul's stuff is earlier, that doesn't mean that the stuff mentioning Joseph of Arimathea isn't also early, right?
Sure.
So, and plus, creeds by their nature aren't designed to give a detailed account of everything that took place. They're more like, when you go into a meeting, they're like you're a lawyer. Like
it's a broad overview. I understand. I think that if
I was just gonna let me run through these and then we'll get back to it. So that's the point I'm making, that the burial narrative is early. It doesn't mention Joseph of Arimathea, but this is part of the earliest Christian belief. And then when you come to 2 independent historical sources about the biography of Jesus, the Synoptics and John, regardless of the discrepancies about the tomb, regardless of the discrepancies about how many women were there, the core piece of that that's consistent throughout it is that Joseph of Arimathea was the one that requested Jesus' body and buried him into the grave. Now, you mentioned, some of those things don't line up as far as the stone rolling away, the women of the tomb, but even in ancient history, discrepancies in certain accounts doesn't mean there's a core historical piece to it. So, for instance, there are at least 3 separate accounts of the burning of Rome, and the question is, okay, where was Nero during the burning of Rome? One has him in the palace, one says he's out of town, one says that he was playing a flute. Well, those are 3 separate accounts, but all of those accounts lay the blame on Nero, and all 3 accounts state that Rome was burned. So regardless of the peripheral things, that core history is still there. So that's kind of my answer to point 1, and then about the narrative. So I'll let you respond to that, but I also want to get to the common practice as well that you mentioned.
Sure. Well, and I think that I may be getting us caught up on something that isn't quite essential to the discussion. So, I mean, if the first contention is Jesus was crucified, the second contention is Jesus was buried, I think that we can put a flag there and say, for the sake of conversation and making the most of the time we have, that sure, Jesus was buried after he was crucified. I don't know how one would demonstrate that Jesus was given over to Joseph of Arimathea, but I think that you're maybe making the point that it doesn't particularly matter. It's not central to the
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think the only point to that would be, sure, the common practice. You make a good point, and I see that point, that the common practice during the time was for people that were on the cross to either be thrown in a mass grave or to be left there for the birds. Now, there's two points regarding Jesus that I think is central to this conversation and why this is more likely than not. Number one is crucified victims that were Jewish would be permitted to be taken down off the cross because Rome would allow certain places throughout the empire to still keep their cultural rituals around, right? So one of the things for Israel was to make sure that the land was pure, make sure the land was pure per tongue twister, per Deuteronomy, so that they would take these guys down. They would give them a burial so that the land would remain pure. It was a belief of theirs. But also, we really don't see Rome denying them that type of practice until about 66, 68 to 70, when there's the Jewish rebellion. Once once the rebellion started and once the war was on, all bets were off as far as keeping your cultural practices going. So prior to, I think it's 66 to 68, this was something that is common, and Craig Evans mentions that in his writings as well. And I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be allowed in the case of Jesus, since Jesus was crucified before 66 to 68. And I don't see Joseph of Arimathea being a mythical figure. He's a member of the Sanhedrin. It doesn't make sense to me why a writer would go ahead and invent a member of the Sanhedrin, because the members of the Sanhedrin were prominent men in Jerusalem. They were the most well-known guys around. So those are my responses to those 3 points, but go ahead.
I'll tell you two things. One thing that came to mind when you were talking about Nero, and just as sort of an aside, is if there are discrepancies about something like the burning of Rome, I get it. But if the architect of the historical event in question is the creator of the universe, and the event that we're talking about is sort of the pivotal moment in not just local human history, but sort of cosmic, spiritual, the entire plan. I think that the idea that that there would be discrepancies in the telling of that seem sort of less plausible to me. I understand that the people passing the message along are human beings and imperfect and fallible, but it's a sort of a meme that gets passed around of why would a perfect God put the carrying out of his message and his plan in the hands of fallible beings. And that gets to sort of another meme, which is the Jew who has seen the error of his ways. And the idea that the story of Joseph of Arimathea wouldn't serve a particular purpose, I think is I don't know. It strikes me as being, could this have just been how it happened? Sure. I don't know how we would demonstrate that Joseph of Arimathea did what the narrative says that he does, but again, for the sake of conversation, I think I'm fully comfortable just saying, sure, yeah, why not? And what you said about surrendering the body to somebody at that time in history, sure. But again, I think that the next step is where we start to get into the real meat of the conversation, which is, what happened next.
Well, real quick, guys, if I could just interject, I do have a first question, which just kind of goes to what you're talking about, Dean. It comes from Cindy PLAZA. The central question here is, why should the Bible be a source of information about what Bible claims?
Gotcha. That's a great. Oh, sorry.
No. So yeah, you can answer that, and then you can go ahead and resume. Yeah, great question, Cindy. So one of the things that we have to be careful about is holding the ancient texts with regards to Jesus's life to a different standard that we would hold all the other ancient texts about any other historical event. So in the same way that if I wanted to find out information about the Civil War, what would I do? I would consult documents pertaining to the Civil War. If I wanted to know about the Battle of Gettysburg, what would I do? I would, look in documents around that time and say, okay, well, is this what took place at Gettysburg? Is this what took place on the north side, the south side? How did that battle shape up? Or if I wanted to ask questions about Rome, during the Gallic Wars, what would I do? I'd look at Roman sources about what was going on at that time. So I think it's fair game to simply mine the earliest documents about Christianity and the life of Jesus to see through historical method, what took place and what's more likely history or not history. So I think that's a good question. But if we're looking as I am tonight as just historical documents, we're certainly allowed to look at Christian documents to figure out things about Christianity.
I think that a key thing that should be pointed out, though, is that using the Civil War as an example, if the really the only evidence that the Civil War took place was letters by people who claimed that the war had taken place and a series of anonymously written tracts about the events of the Civil War, that the earliest copies that we had were, around.
I don't know what just happened there.
I don't know. Can you hear me, Ethan?
I can hear you. Something happened with Kenneth's connection.
Oh,
there we go. Now he's back.
Sorry, we lost you. So could you just repeat everything that you just said?
Ethan, what was the last thing that came through? I don't want to bore any viewers to death.
A little sign in here.
I apologize. It's hard to say specifically what was the last.
So this is the idea in Cliff Notes version. So if the only evidence that we had for the Civil War were letters that were circulated by people who asserted that the Civil War had happened, and a series of anonymously written tracts that the earliest copies that we had emerged sometime around the Great Depression, I think that people would be right to question whether the war took place, or at the very least, whether the events described in the documents happened the way that the documents say they happened, especially when we start getting into supernatural claims like the resurrection of the dead.
Okay, so my point in the Civil War analogy was simply to show that it's not off base to consult the earliest possible sources of a particular group to see if that is historical. And now I understand your point about the anonymity of the Gospels. Now, we can go down this line. We can talk about authorship of the Gospels and things like that. I don't have a problem with it. I don't want to stay there too long since we're talking about the resurrection. But I would say a couple of things, about that. So can I ask you a question in response to what you've said?
Yeah, anything.
Okay, so do you believe that Alexander the Great was a historical figure?
Was a historical figure? Absolutely.
Okay, so his earliest biography isn't until 400 years after he lives, and it's written by Plutarch. But we would both say that he's a historical figure. Right now, all I'm saying is that given that parameter, then it seems to me if we have early sources that are within 100 years of Jesus's life, we can ask questions about whether these things took place. But if we have early sources and a creed that dates between 3 to 7 years after the event of Jesus's death, I find it interesting that we're not willing to say, okay, this is good source material with regards to the life of Jesus. Now we can talk about the supernatural, but just from the dating standpoint, it seems like these are good sources that are inside 100 years of Jesus' life, a formal creed that's within 3 to 7 years after his death. Whereas in comparison to Alexander the Great, he's 400 years after the fact. His biography doesn't show up till 400 years after his death. So I struggle to see why that's necessarily a issue if on one hand we're accepting Alexander and on the other hand we're not going to accept documents that are within that 100-year period. Now, I agree with the statement that the earliest manuscripts are anonymous. I completely agree with you on that, Kenneth. But I would also say, in response to that, there's pretty good attestation to the authorship of these Gospels in early church history, early to second half of the 2nd century, and there's no alternative tradition about who wrote these documents. So I want to know if why wouldn't that satisfy the idea of who wrote these? I
think that the question of who wrote them isn't necessarily what I'm hung up on, but I think using Alexander as an example would be great. And this is probably a good place to put a pin in this before we get to the next thing. Is I can accept that Alexander would have been a historical figure, but there are biographies of Alexander, like you mentioned Plutarch. There are biographies that assert that Alexander was born of a virgin. Same with Genghis Khan. So I'm perfectly comfortable looking at other evidence suggesting that these individuals lived, while also remaining skeptical about any claims regarding abiogenesis. I think that's where the issue hinges for me. Claims like Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Why not? Jesus attended a wedding around his 30th birthday. Sure. Jesus turned water into wine at that wedding. I don't know how we would even go about proving something like that.
Gotcha.
So that's where the Gospels start to get a little bit iffy for me, and their removal from the dates when they describing the events that allegedly occurred. I don't think stacks favorably for them. Could the Gospels be fully, completely spot on accurate in every respect? Absolutely, but I don't know how we would go about proving that.
Gotcha. And
if I may jump in real quick,
yeah.
Kenneth, we have a question. It's actually a very quick question, but Larry wants to know. You said absolutely.
I did say absolutely.
So, if you could clarify.
I think that my level of certainty regarding my ability to accept the proposition that Alexander was a historical figure, I'm as maximally sure about my ability to accept that assertion as anything else in my life.
That's a great answer.
Thank you. All right. If you have questions for either of them, we'll get to them soon. Go ahead, Dean. You can continue.
So yeah, I don't want to go really any further. I'd love to come back to that at some point because I think there's an issue. I think the bigger difference is the time frame between the events of Alexander when it was recorded and the events of Jesus and when those were recorded. It's just a shorter period of time, but let's not get hung up on that. Let's move to the next one. I think this is where you and I are going to have the most conversation. I think this is the part where the audience is kind of like, hopefully they're like, all right, get to it. So the third thing that I'm going to defend tonight is that the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which they believed that they had seen Jesus bodily raised from the dead. So I'll kick it to you and you
Sure.
Go ahead and put whatever type of semtex in that argument you want to put in it.
Yeah, I mean, the question of how belief impacts behavior is a fascinating one to me. So I think that anybody who would make an assertion like, no, they didn't have those experiences, is unreasonable. I think that, if someone has the experience of seeing Jesus, whether we're talking about Thomas or, in many of the resurrection narratives, Jesus appears to people after resurrecting. Great. People may have had those experiences. I'll take them at their word, but it's not hard to find people who've experienced seeing Elvis at the diner or who will tell you about their experiences being abducted by aliens. I think that human beings are known to be unreliable in establishing the causal link between their experience and, what in fact did they experience. So that's where I don't see the distinction between I saw the risen Jesus and I saw Elvis at the diner.
No, I'm just making a note here. Right. So I think, in each one of those things, you as a lawyer, me as a dreaded, nasty, dirty apologist.
What's worse?
Yeah, that maybe that's a poll that we need to ask the audience. What's worse, an apologist or a lawyer?
Actually, no. Let's say this in the audience. What's worse, an atheist or an apologist? That I'm curious to see, because it's never mind. I'll just let the audience vote. Gentlemen, continue.
So I'm not hard and fast on some of these things. I think we need to take each thing on a case by case basis. From what I understand about Elvis sightings at the diner, as far as I know, Elvis's grave hasn't been exhumed and that his body is still in the grave. So to say that someone saw Elvis at the diner, you would say, okay, well, let's go over and check and see if his body is still in the grave.
Right.
Where that's different from, essentially what we find in the synoptics and John, and even in Matthew's account. At the very end, Matthew writes about the first polemic that the Jews gave following this, the death of Jesus, and it wasn't, "Hey, let's go to the grave and find the body," or "Hey, that's really cool that he resurrected, but he's right over there." It was, "Hey, if word gets to the governor, we'll just tell him that in the night while you were asleep, the disciples came and stole his body." That the admission there is not that the charge there is not, the admission in that polemic is that there is no body in the grave, right? So I think that's a little bit different than the Elvis sighting. Plus, you also have situations where the Elvis sighting is current, and here we're dealing with ancient history. So I'd say that those are the main differences between those two. Now, I just want to ask one question, and you can respond to what I've said and then also the question. What do you think is the best explanation for those experiences that the disciples had?
Well, it's hard to say. I think that speculating on that doesn't seem fruitful to me, because people have all kinds of experiences. I think that I can't judge the grandma in Memphis who saw Elvis at the diner's motives either. I don't think that people use words like hallucination. People talk about motivated reasoning being used to describe apparitions and things like that. I'm fully comfortable saying I don't know what the reasoning was, if there even was reasoning. I don't think people necessarily choose to see the things that they see or to have the experiences they have. They just have the experience. I keep thinking about the Gospels. I mean, and I'm familiar with what you're talking about. I think in Matthew, where the idea of the Pharisees sort of bribing the guards to say that the apostles stole the body if anybody asks about it. But that only appears in Matthew.
No, you're right. It does.
I mean,
I agree.
I'm thinking about, those bits and pieces in the gospel narratives are a sticking point. But yeah, I think that belief in seeing the risen Jesus versus actually seeing the risen Jesus is something that is hard to. How do you prove it?
Well, I guess my question would then be in return, what historical evidence would you need provided to you to convince you that this is what they saw?
Well, and again, that's a hard question, because I'm not necessarily disputing that they saw something. But I would say that, just approaching this, from my limited perspective, the number one cause of convictions being overturned right now in the United States in criminal cases is bad eyewitness testimony. And that's firsthand eyewitness testimony. And what we have in the Gospels isn't firsthand eyewitness testimony. We have accounts of eyewitness testimony, which is another way of saying not eyewitness testimony. So we have essentially hearsay evidence about events, inconsistent hearsay evidence accounts of a supernatural occurrence. So I don't know what burden. I don't know what the evidentiary standard would be to establish that, because even firsthand accounts today about, there's this category of evidence, spectral evidence, is not allowed in court. But on a personal level, the simple answer is I don't know what it would take.
So, well, I would come back and say, I think we have good evidence. I haven't heard an answer to the evidence I provided regarding the writing of the Gospels through church history, which is attested by multiple church fathers that are closer to the time of writing. Some of them, the latest I believe is middle second century, so like 150 to 170 AD. We have a tradition that Mark and Jenna wrote these. There's no counter tradition. So then, if it seems to me that if you're going to say that we don't know who wrote these, and then the claim that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote these, and the answer to that is, well, no, they didn't. We don't know who wrote it. You'd have to provide evidence as to why those guys didn't write it.
Okay, let me address that specifically.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I've heard Richard Carrier make the analogy, and I kind of stole from him a little bit earlier. So he said that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus would be like if there was a story about a soldier in World War II who raised himself from the dead, and that the only evidence for this was a series of anonymously written tracts that circulated in the 1980s. So if I was skeptical about those and someone said, no, those were written by Steve, and then I said, okay, well, how do I know that? And then a lot of people said, no, really, those were written by Steve. And it makes sense that Steve wrote that. Even if I concede, okay, Steve heard from a guy that some soldier 60 years ago, 40 years ago, raised himself from the dead. I don't see how the evidence becomes any stronger.
So, so one of the things that I would mention with regards to that is twofold with regards to the specific appearances. Let's go ahead and say, and I'll come back to this, but let's go ahead and say for now, I see that what you're saying about the Gospels could be true. That still doesn't discount the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, that scholars who are of all stripes state that that's an early oral creed that dates to 3 to 7 years after Jesus' death, in which it specifically says, as Paul is talking, he says, For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, from whom most remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles.
Right.
So, I mean, and I don't see your point on the Gospels, but let's say that I did. You would still have this early oral creed between 3 and 7 years after the event that states, hey, this is what took place. So
right.
How do you respond to that early oral creed that's dated, not 50 years later, not 60 years later, but like 3 to 7 years later? So
it's the same problem of secondhand information being asserted as fact. So you can't count, for example, the appearance of Jesus to the 500 as 500 eyewitnesses. You count it as one secondhand account of Jesus appearing to 500 people. So you have Paul saying, Jesus appeared to those guys. Well, I don't have those guys to talk to. He doesn't give us any information about those guys. We don't have those guys' accounts. We just have Paul saying, no, really, I swear it happened. And then what happens next in 1 Corinthians 15 is this just avalanche of fallacious appeals to authority and to consequence and to emotion of why you should believe. Well, if Jesus's resurrection didn't happen, then we're all dead. You know, if there's no resurrection of the dead, then there's no resurrection of Jesus, and then we won't be resurrected spiritually or otherwise. Okay. And then, you know, he goes, and our witness would be proven false. Well, okay, that's just Paul going, you know, are you calling me a liar? Well, I don't know. Maybe you're just wrong about this stuff, man. I mean, you're hearing it from other people.
Yeah. So I would agree with you on that if in his writings to the Galatians, he mentions that after his conversion, 3 years after his conversion, he goes up to Jerusalem, and it says that he visited the apostles there. And the word for visit there is literally the word that we get history from, and that's also documented in Acts. I don't know if you're accepting Acts as historical. It's okay if you don't. So it's one of those things where Paul goes up and he visits the disciples,
right.
And New Testament historians suggest that this is where that creed came from. He interviewed, not like he was talking about how you know, the Jerusalem you know, Lions of the Tribe of Judah football team was doing there in Jerusalem. He was interviewing them as to say, okay, what happened? And then it says, you know, I think it's 14 years or 15 years after that, he goes back up to Jerusalem to talk to the apostles, to make sure that he's preaching the same gospel,
right,
that they're preaching together. So I see your point as far as, you know, the emotional appeal, things like that. But it seems to me that if you have a early oral creed that's 3 to 7 years after the event, that it's rooted in this this belief by the disciples that they actually saw Jesus. And so far you've said, hey, you know, this is kind of like a secondhand account. But it seems to me that when we look at this creed, that creed is directly tied to the apostles in Jerusalem, early oral creed. And then on top of that, I haven't heard a defeater for why they really didn't see him in that.
Well, so I'm not saying definitively they didn't see him. I'm saying that there's not really any way of demonstrating it. And I think that what we're dealing with are claims. And again, just to really drill down on it, a specific claim that a person who was dead is now alive and appearing to his bros. I think that claim would need to be demonstrated before anybody would have a justification for believing it. I grew up in San Diego, and when I was a little kid, there was this horrific event that happened. There was a mansion in a neighborhood named Rancho Santa Fe, and a group of people who thought there was a spaceship coming behind a comet to take them off this earth committed mass suicide. It was a cult called Heaven's Gate. And they fully believed that their leaders were in communication with the people piloting this spaceship. In fact, when they actually bought a telescope to look at the comet, and when they couldn't see the spaceship, they returned the telescope because they thought it was defective. So people believe stuff. People believe they see stuff. People believe other people's claims. And that's where I think we're standing with regards to the claims of seeing the risen Jesus.
Right. So is there any any evidence within those claims, though, that there was ever really a spaceship there with Heaven's Gate? That's my question.
No, it was just a claim. And I can't prove there wasn't a spaceship any more than I can prove that these guys didn't see the risen Jesus.
Gotcha. So then the only other piece that I think we need to incorporate into this discussion now, I'll go back real quick. We can go ahead because we can.
If I may, real quick. So
yeah, go ahead.
Just because we do still have some time, but if you could give what you think is the best evidence for, Jesus rising from the dead, and then possibly allowing Ken to respond, and then we can get to some questions.
Wow. I think my four lines of reasoning are my best evidences. To pick between those four, I'll narrow it down to potentially two, and I don't know if I can even do that. I would say, I would probably say the creed in 1 Corinthians, and then the conversion of Paul, which would be my fourth line of evidence, is that Paul, enemy of Christianity, had a experience in which he believed he saw the risen Jesus, and then became a disciple and apostle and speaker for Christianity.
Yeah. So, and I think that the creed that you're referring to is itself a selection, or rather a collection of claims. I don't think that they're necessarily evidence of anything other than belief, and that sort of dovetails into the question of Paul. And Paul is an interesting figure, because what I think you're doing is essentially making a sort of secondhand argument from personal experience here, that Paul had this Damascus Road experience and it changed his life. He went from a persecutor to a champion of the faith. And it's arguing that a person's life being changed by a belief is evidence for the truth value of that belief. I was talking to my fiance about this earlier today. I think that's a really, it's frankly shocking to me in a post 9/11 world, because all of us know that there were 19 individuals whose lives were absolutely changed by their belief. There was a sincere conviction that what they needed to do with their lives based on their theology was crash some planes into some buildings. That is a level of commitment to belief that I don't have in many places in my own life. But I don't think that that's evidence for the theology that those guys bought into. I think that a life being changed by a belief is evidence of the power of belief, and not necessarily in evidence for anything else. So
are you saying that that's the case for Paul?
I want to be clear. I'm not equating Paul with the 9/11 hijackers in any way other than that.
No, I gotcha.
That belief is sufficient to change someone's life, whether or not their belief in something is true or not.
But I would rejoin to 2 points, and I'll group Paul and the disciples in this as well. Paul didn't travel around with Jesus. He was against Jesus. He was against Christianity. So it's not like he started out with this belief that, okay, this guy right here is the Messiah. He started out with the belief the Messiah carries out persecution supposedly in Acts chapter 8. I'll be generous to the skeptic there. So the question that I think you've got to answer in regards to both of these, both Paul and the disciples, is, okay, so it's not that Paul had the belief that Jesus was the Messiah. It's that Paul had an experience in which he believed he saw the risen Jesus. And so if that's off the table, then what's the explanation for Paul now becoming a heralder of the gospel? And then with the disciples, you said, hey, we're just showing that this is the power of belief. This is the power of belief. But these are even with the creed, these are beliefs that are grounded in an experience that so far, from what I understand, you can correct me if I'm wrong, so far you've said, sure, I think that they had those experiences. I'm not disputing whether or not that they saw Jesus. So these are beliefs that are grounded in experiences with the disciples that you've yet to really dispute that they had those experiences.
Sure, a life-changing experience. But I think that, you can look at people who convert from one religion to the other. And there's obviously millions of people who do this, where you can be fully committed to the doctrines of Christianity, fully committed to the idea that Jesus is the Messiah, have an experience an epiphany and then convert to Judaism and change your life and give up bacon forever, which is, again, this is an outrageous level of commitment to a belief. So I think that nailing down the distinction that having an experience is in no way indicative of what caused that experience, and then that experience has the capacity to change your life based on the beliefs that you attach to that experience, I think should be uncontroversial. These things are seen. I'm thinking of a friend of mine who converted to, she's a Hare Krishna devotee right now, and has been for a number of years, because she had profound experiences while meditating of leaving the astral plane and traveling to other planets and stuff. And she told me sincerely about these experiences, and I can't dispute that she firmly believed that she's walked on the surface of other planets. Do I think that she actually did? No, but I think her experience is real. I think this is probably caused by some sort of, chemical state in her brain.
But that would be different than, say, the polymodal nature of the experiences that the disciples had, right? So it's not like one disciple had one private experience. Even in the creed of 1 Corinthians, there's accounts of individual experiences, group experiences. The Gospels mention, these polymodal experiences the disciples had, meaning that, hey, at one point Jesus is talking to disciples on the road to Emmaus. Another point, Jesus is talking to the seven with Thomas. Another point, he's cooking breakfast with, Peter and other disciples. That's a little bit different than one person privately experiencing something. This is group appearances that take place at the same time, at the same place, and they're all experiencing the same thing.
How do we know that based on the narrative? How do we know that based on the gospel narrative that they all experience the same thing?
Right. So what you have in the Gospels and the Synoptics is you have these group experiences in which there's a record and a consistent record that Jesus showed up and saw multiple disciples at different points at different times. Mm-hmm. Right. So, those are the experiences, number one, that are recorded in the earliest biographies of Jesus, but also two, are reinforced in other areas of scripture, like the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, and also like the history that Paul got when he visited Jerusalem via Galatians.
Sure. I'm thinking of, because I'm just thinking about how you talked about that they're experiencing the same things. And so just looking at the earliest gospel, do we agree that would be Mark?
I would agree in all likelihood. Mark is there. Yeah.
Okay. So we've got Mary going to visit Jesus's body. We've got the stones already rolled away. We've got the young man dressed in white inside saying, Jesus isn't here, go tell the apostles. And the women don't tell anybody, and they run away, and they're freaked out. Begging the question, if they didn't tell anybody, how did we find out about that? But then, and that's where the book of Mark, the oldest manuscripts end. And then verses 9 through 20 of the chapter are then added later, where Jesus then appears to Mary. Jesus then appears to some disciples, and it says in another form, without describing at all what that means.
Where is that in Mark again? Sorry.
So we're Mark.
No, I see 9 through 20 is definitely. Yeah. It says there, even as I'm looking at it right now, it says that some of the early 9 to 20, and I would see that.
Right.
And in the ring that I run in, I would probably be classified as out of touch by not accepting 9 through 20, and I don't accept 9 through 20. Okay.
I mean, I know that a lot of Christians reject it because of all the stuff about snake handling and drinking poison and not being harmed and these kind of things. I don't know.
I mean, I'm good with it or without it, is what I'm saying. But I still think you have a resurrection occurrence in Mark, at the end of Mark, because right there at 6, it says don't be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. So even without 9 through 20, you still have a resurrection.
All right. Oh, we got some questions. Okay. So, sorry to cut you guys off. There are just some things we need to get to before time runs out. So, first question is for Dean. Why did you decide to use the passage from 1 Corinthians after the basis of inconsistent hearsay account was made?
Why did I decide to use 1 Corinthians 15? I don't think that the Gospels are inconsistent hearsay. I was moving to 1 Corinthians 15 to supplement the accounts of the Gospels, because the Gospels are early biography of Jesus. 1 Corinthians 15 is the earliest source creed for the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. They're two different classifications.
All right. Next question is from Linda. This is for you, Kenneth. Why do we dispute other person's experiences in another realm? Just because you did not experience it does not mean it did not happen.
I would fully agree with Linda that just because I didn't experience something doesn't mean it didn't happen. I think that the whole question, though, is why should anyone else believe the account of the experience? And the specific issue of why do we dispute other person's experiences in another realm is because beliefs, I forget who said this, but there's this idea that belief is a lever that once pulled affects your behavior. And I think, today, tens of thousands of Christians with good intentions and love in their hearts went to Easter services and defied stay-at-home orders because of what they believe. Beliefs have consequences. So I think that's point one. And point two is, just because I didn't experience it doesn't mean it didn't happen. But then how can I know whether a person's telling the truth or if they're mistaken about their experience?
Thank you. OEF Bugout just wanted to point out that he thinks using Alexander the Great is a bad choice, given that the dynasties founded by his generals survived for centuries, forming a clear progression of power.
Okay.
Can I take that really quick? Just from what I would have said when I was a Christian was that the apostles would have been like generals, and that there's a clear progression of power from Jesus to the modern day church, analogous to Alexander. I don't know if that's the type of tack that Dean would take, but that's what I would have said when I was a Christian.
Okay. Sure. There you go.
All right. Ken, follow up from Linda. It is their choice to believe it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. I just immediately in my mind, I'm thinking of because our choices and our beliefs impact other people. I think that we have a responsibility to make sure that the things that we believe, are accurate, that they reflect reality. If somebody believes that the best way to live their life, is to hurt other people, I think that there's a discussion that needs to be had there. Once beliefs may have a detrimental effect on others, I think that the fact that it's their choice to have that belief, I respect that, but I think that we all have to share this planet.
Thank you. Cindy, Dean, this is a question from Cindy. Dean has been responding to my question and later to Kenneth's remarks with an argument of time proximity, not addressing the obvious bias of text made to establish a belief. How does he address that? I'm
not sure what Cindy means by not addressing the obvious bias of the text made to establish a belief. If we're historical evidence on the basis of bias, then we'd have to throw out all of history, because history is done through the prism of specific biases of the writers. That's how history comes to us. So I guess I don't understand Cindy's question, if it's just a matter of bias.
Cindy, if you could possibly properly rephrase it to make it easier to understand. All right, so this question is for both of you. Kenneth, go ahead and answer first. How can we depend on what the Bible says when it has been translated so many times and translation goes by the person translating? Also, words can change meanings as time goes on.
My initial reaction is that whether a document has been translated over and over and over again doesn't necessarily have a relationship to whether the claims being made are true or not. I understand that people use the analogy of a game of telephone to describe the oral traditions that would have then led to a written, gospel. But I think that the claims should be evaluated on their own, regardless of how many times they've been translated, if that makes sense.
All right. Dean?
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Ken said. The issue is not the translation. The issue is the transmission of the text from the event down through the centuries. And what we know is that the text of the New Testament is at a 99.5% transmission rate. Slips of the pen, misspellings of names are the big issues within the text, but they don't undercut any core Christian doctrine. Says that in his appendix of misquoting Jesus. The question is not the transmission of the text. The question is, okay, is this text historical? So that's the question that we're addressing. Also, sure, words change meaning as time goes on. That's why when you look at what the New Testament says, we have to take the meaning of the text based upon the definitions of the words that are being used by the author in the author's context. I hope that makes sense. Real quick. Oh, sorry. I was going to elaborate a little bit. So like when we see the word faith in the New Testament, it means, trust. It doesn't mean a blind, uninquisitive lip into the theological abyss, right? That's a modern phraseology that we use with regards to faith as a blind faith. So that's just one example.
All right. So Marcia wants us to point out that one word can change the entire meaning, and the author is the translator.
Go ahead, Ken.
I think Martha's making a great point with regards to the idea of the limitations of language. I think that this speaks to a bigger issue with the belief that there is a God and that God occasionally dabbles in literature as a means of conveying his message. I think that, the limitations of language, the limitations of human beings are sort of a curious method for attempting to convey arguably the most important ideas imaginable.
I would just say that those ideas have been transmitted to a 99.5% rate. But I understand the issue of language, and I think that the point Ken makes is a critical one and something that needs to be discussed on another show. I think it's a good point, though. Not that I agree completely with it.
Before I give you guys a chance to close out, I would just like to point out a few things. So tomorrow night at 4:30 p.m., I have another medium and tarot card reader coming on. And this time we will be doing it as through the scientific method as best as possible. So I have two people that I don't personally know. I only know them through Facebook. Those two people do not know the medium. They are both coming on to the stream, and the medium will do a reading on those two people that neither of us know. And then afterwards, I will give my feedback on how I think it was done and if I can do it or not. Then Tuesday, very important discussion. I will be sitting down with Lucas, very smart guy. We're going to go into the topic of science and God. He's got his master's in physics. And again, I don't want to undersell him. I don't have all of his credentials here, but he is going to tell me how science got him to God. Also,
I know Lucas.
Oh, you do? That's been good. Hopefully you'll watch the discussion. Before I give you guys closing, I do have a question for first you, Dean, and then you, Kenneth.
Yeah, go ahead.
Psychics. What's your opinion?
Geez, I haven't thought about psychics since Miss Brown. He used to show up on the Maury, I think it was the Maury Povich show a lot back in the day. I really have no idea. If I would lean towards no, but it's a tentative one. I'm open to the possibility, I guess.
And then for simplicity's sake, do you believe in ghosts, or do you think ghosts are?
Believe in ghosts? No, I don't believe in ghosts.
Okay, thank you. Kenneth, psychics and then ghosts.
So my opinion about psychics was heavily influenced by I saw Penn and Teller's show years ago at the Rio in Las Vegas. And
Penn and Teller's bullshit?
No, they're live like magic.
Oh, okay.
Show. And Penn circulates books to people in the audience at random and has them pick random. I mean, we're talking about big, thick books, and he does this cold reading exercise, and it is just incredible. And then he explains sort of how it's done. And I was heavily influenced by the spiel that Penn gave after that. My opinion regarding psychics is where I veer from skeptic to cynic. And I generally have a highly unfavorable view of psychics. I think of them as con artists.
Thank you. So we'll see how this goes. The first reading I had yesterday. Sorry, it wasn't yesterday. I'm mixing up my days. This quarantine has me going mad. But it didn't go in her favor. But I guess apparently I was too skeptical and I had my guard up. So
could I just say one thing, and charity to the psychics and psychic community? I want to differentiate between, I think that there are clearly people who are using cold reading techniques to fleece people, but I do think that there are people who sincerely believe that they are in contact with some other plane, and I would not lump those people together.
Actually, I'm glad you clarified. I completely agree with that. Yeah. Okay, so Dean, in closing, did Jesus rise from the dead, and what would you like to say about it?
Yeah, I think the evidence supports the idea that that Jesus rose from the dead. Given tonight's discussion, there are a couple of things that I'd like to just point out as I close. Number one, I appreciate Kenneth coming on for having a conversation, Ethan for hosting. Number two, notice throughout this discussion that Ken agreed with me on points 1 and points 2, even if they were tentative agreements. And then on point 3, when we looked at the gospel narratives, when we looked at 1 Corinthians 15, when we looked at those two pieces of information, Ken agreed that those experiences took place. He never offered a alternative solution as to what those experiences could be outside of them actually seeing the risen Jesus. He simply said, "Oh, well, this is hearsay." I specifically didn't hear Ken say why he believes that that's hearsay outside of the time of the writing and the dating, which by historical standards is inside any reputable gap, specifically with 1 Corinthians 15 and the Gospels. And then when we came to Paul, we really didn't have enough time to get into Paul. He said, "Hey, Paul had that, or Paul, probably had some type of experience." Once again, Ken didn't really say what the alternative would be outside of seeing Jesus. So on the basis of those 4 facts and some of the counters that Ken provided, I think that the evidence is more probable than not that Jesus rose from the dead. And once again, I would encourage people to go back and not look just through this discussion, but also the evidence as well.
Yeah, and I really appreciate Dean being here. I really appreciate Ethan hosting. I think it's extremely commendable when apologists stand up and defend their beliefs. So in keeping with the sort of legal terminology, my position would be that Jesus would be not guilty of resurrecting. I'm using that language very intentionally because if there's a crime committed and someone tells you the butler did it, and you don't have a plausible explanation for someone else doing it, and you can't disprove the claim the butler did it, That doesn't mean the butler did it. The person who carries that burden of proof has to demonstrate that the butler did it before that person would be guilty. So if we're trying to assess whether or not Jesus was resurrected, I'm not making the claim that he didn't do it, but I'm making the claim that I'm not convinced, and that I don't think that it's reasonable to reach that conclusion based on the very, very limited and poor quality evidence that we have. The fact that I cannot come up with an alternative explanation for Paul's experiences is no different than me being in a position of not being able to come up with an alternative explanation for the lady seeing Elvis at the diner. That doesn't mean that the lady saw Elvis at the diner.
Thanks. So just for clarification, what Dean's saying is you didn't have an alternative explanation for his claim. And you're saying you don't need to have one. You're just simply rejecting his claim, and you're not required to provide an alternative, correct?
Regarding that specific claim that Dean is making, that would essentially be my position, yeah.
And you're saying that because you're not able to provide an alternative, that doesn't make his claim any more true?
More or less.
Okay. Awesome.
It just remains an unverified claim.
Thank you for clarifying, guys. I really appreciate you both coming on, especially on Easter Sunday. And here, for clarity, this actually wasn't my idea. This was Dean's. So props to Dean on this one. And I really appreciate you spending your Easter Sunday with two atheists.
No problem.
I hope I was fair, and I hope I let the conversation go naturally.
I think you were definitely fair. And if it's okay if I offer an invitation at some point in the future. I've seen your schedule, Ethan. It's packed with 75 shows and 100 million guests. At some point,
I'm trying.
At some point, I'd love to have a conversation with Kenneth again about the existence of God, if that's possible.
I mean,
and there was one question that we forgot. There's one question that we forgot that you told me to hold off because you wanted it to be organic.
I don't remember the question now.
When I asked in the pre-chat about what evidence would he need to believe that Jesus rose from the dead.
Yeah, and I know that people think this is a Weasley way to answer the question, but I think it's the only reasonable one there is that I don't know. I used to have this real smart ass answer where I would say if someone prayed to Jesus for an amputee to be healed and the leg grew back, then that would convince me. But I think the honest answer is that I think that if the risen Jesus wanted to have a relationship with me, wanted me to be aware of his status and existence and all that he would know what it would take and would provide that. So I'm left thinking that either it's not real or he doesn't want to have a relationship with me yet.
Man, I want to ask so many follow-ups, but I can't. So
all right, you can have one follow-up and then we got to go.
Then we got to go. Okay, so Ken, you said I don't know what I would need. Right. So my question would be, if you didn't know let me clarify. You said, I don't know what evidence I would need to believe. So my next question would be, how would you know when that evidence came about?
Well, I think that I don't think that it's up to us. I know that there's some dispute about this in philosophical circles. I don't think it's up to an individual to be convinced of something or not. I think that if sufficient evidence is given to you, that you are convinced. So I can't. If someone asked me, at what point did you choose to accept that 2 + 2 = 4? What was the standard of evidence that was sufficient for you to adopt that belief? I wouldn't really know what to tell them. It was demonstrated to me that 2 + 2 = 4, and now I can't see 2 + 2 really in any other way. So I think that I hope that answers the question.
Well, that's kind of like my question is like, how would you know when the evidence was sufficient if you don't know what evidence?
When I was convinced. When I was convinced, I guess. If it convinced me, then I'm convinced, then it was sufficient.
So I think I can kind of bridge the gap here, and I hope I'm not wrong. If I am, please correct me. But so to Kenneth's point, a claim will require certain evidence. So let's say right now, I am personally making the claim that there is an invisible black hole behind me. Now, I can't show it to you. It's invisible. Would you know what evidence you would need to show that, since the only account is me saying there's this invisible black hole there?
But if it was an invisible black hole, and so I guess that's the question, like if this was an invisible black hole, how would you know that it was there? Well, since it's invisible.
I'm saying I can see it and I can feel it.
Could I offer a potential thing? I know we're running out of time, but so I'm a New England Patriots fan to the point that my dog is even named Brady.
That's unfortunate.
I know. So there was some
Eli Manning.
Very unfortunate news that came out that Tom Brady was going to be going to Tampa Bay. When I heard the news, I didn't believe it. I was like, no, this is speculation. That's not legit. And then there was this second phase of being like, no, I can't see him doing that. Why Tampa Bay, all this kind of stuff. But there came a point where the evidence overwhelmed not only my disbelief, but my desire to not believe the claim Tom Brady is going to Tampa Bay. I can't tell you what the exact moment was, what it was that overwhelmed my belief, but I was sort of inundated with text messages from friends, of press releases and news stories and things about this event happening. And through no free will of my own, at some point I believed that something horrible happened. So I mean, that to me, I don't know if that's, clear where I'm at.
We can talk about it offline. I still some other stuff I want to. I mean, there's miles and miles of road that I could travel with that, but that's fine. I appreciate the ability to follow up, and I appreciate Ken answering. So,
all right, gentlemen, thanks for coming on. I'm going to drop you into the post studio. I'll be with you in a moment.
All right.
All right, guys. Let me know, guys and girls, everyone in the audience. One, who do you think won? Who do you think presented a better argument? And two, did Jesus rise from the dead? I personally still remain unconvinced. My position is simple. It is entirely possible that a man named Jesus existed. It is entirely possible that that man was crucified. However, I do not believe that he rose from the dead. And to be fair, let's say I accepted that he rose from the dead right now. That doesn't mean I would believe in God. That's an entirely separate discussion, because even if this man named Jesus rose from the dead, it doesn't bridge over to believing in God, at least in my opinion. Anyway, like, subscribe, let me know what you'd like to see next. And let me know who won in the comments. Have a good night, guys. I got to stop saying God.